In the winter of 1989, as the Cold War staggered toward its uneasy end, the Soviet Union launched one of its most ambitious missions. Two spacecraft, Phobos-1 and Phobos-2, were sent to study Mars and its enigmatic moon, Phobos. It was a desperate bid for scientific prestige, one final chance to prove Soviet supremacy in space. Phobos-1 was lost almost immediately, destroyed by a single line of faulty computer code, but Phobos-2 survived. It orbited Mars, transmitting images of the red planet and its strange little moon. The mission seemed back on track, until one final photograph changed everything. On March 27, 1989, Phobos-2 transmitted its last images to Earth. The data was strange. A long, dark shape appeared across the Martian surface, like a shadow, impossibly large. Estimates suggested it stretched for nearly 20 kilometers. Then, without warning, Phobos-2 went silent. It never sent another signal. The official Soviet explanation was a computer malfunction. But engineers who had monitored the final moments whispered something different. They claimed the spacecraft had been functioning perfectly, until something interfered. The blackout was abrupt, surgical, as if Phobos-2 had been switched off. Rumors spread quickly. In Western newspapers, stories surfaced about a cigar-shaped UFO near Mars. Whistleblowers hinted at images never released to the public, frames showing a massive, solid object passing close to the Soviet probe. The Soviets denied everything, but in the shadows of Moscow space institutes, whispers grew darker. Some scientists admitted privately that the last images were inexplicable, that the spacecraft had seen something it should not have. Phobos itself had long been a mystery. Its orbit was unstable, as if it were hollow. In the 1950s, Soviet scientist Iosif Shklovsky even proposed it was artificial, perhaps a captured spacecraft. The idea was ridiculed in the West. But among Soviet circles, the suspicion never entirely died. And now, a Soviet spacecraft had vanished while circling it. The final transmission of Phobos-2 remains one of the great enigmas of space exploration. A shadow, a silence, and a cover-up. But the story doesn't end there, because the shadow in those images was not the first strange object near Earth's neighbors, and it would not be the last. After Phobos-2's sudden loss, the Soviet government scrambled for explanations. Officially, the failure was attributed to a communications malfunction. The narrative was simple: technical problems, nothing more. But inside the Soviet space program, not everyone agreed. Engineers who had monitored the spacecraft in its final moments were unconvinced. They insisted the probe had been healthy, its systems normal, right until the blackout. One described the failure as like someone pulled the plug. The controversy deepened when fragments of the final images leaked to the West. One photograph appeared to show a long, dark ellipse stretched across the Martian surface. NASA scientists who studied the leaked frame admitted it was unusual, but quickly dismissed it as a processing error. The Soviets said nothing, but the rumors kept growing. A French scientist, Dr. Jean-Pierre Rospars, suggested the shadow was too geometrical to be natural. In Germany, tabloid newspapers declared that the Soviets had photographed a UFO. For once, Soviet secrecy played into the myth. The less they said, the more people imagined. Behind closed doors, Soviet scientists debated the possibilities. Some argued it was simply Phobos' own shadow, distorted by the angle of the spacecraft. Others whispered about an unknown object near the moon, a solid body, perhaps a spacecraft, that had approached too close. One engineer reportedly remarked, "It was as if the probe encountered something that didn't want to be photographed." The idea was not without precedent. In 1971, the Soviet Mars 3 lander had transmitted just 20 seconds of data before going silent. At the time, the loss was blamed on a dust storm. But in hindsight, some wondered, had something silenced Mars 3 too? The Phobos-2 case became tangled in the mythology of the Cold War. To the West, it was another Soviet failure, proof of their declining space power. To Soviet citizens, it was a mystery never explained, buried under collapsing bureaucracy, as the USSR itself fell apart. But the most chilling detail came from Soviet insiders years later. They claimed the last images transmitted by Phobos-2 had been confiscated, locked away in classified archives, never shown again. Only fragments remained, and those fragments were enough to ignite a legend. A spacecraft silenced in orbit, a shadow stretching across Mars, and a question that refused to die. What did Phobos-2 really see before it was lost? For decades, only fragments of Phobos-2's final transmissions have been shown to the public. Grainy images, strips of data, a shadow that seems to stretch unnaturally across the Martian surface. But what do those images really show? One frame in particular has become infamous. Against the pale terrain of Mars, a long, dark shape appears. It is not circular, like Phobos' shadow. It is elongated, cigar-shaped. Engineers estimated it to be 20 kilometers in length, too massive, too precise to dismiss as artifact. Some explanations were simple. Supporters of the malfunction theory insisted it was just a smear in the camera's processing. Others argued it was a trick of geometry, Phobos' own shadow, distorted by distance. But neither answer satisfied the people who had seen the raw data. A leaked account from Soviet scientist Marina Popovich, later nicknamed the Russian UFO lady, claimed that the object was real. She described it as an unknown body near the spacecraft. Popovich, who had deep ties to the Soviet Air Force, hinted that Phobos-2 had been neutralized by this object. It wasn't the first time spacecraft had encountered anomalies near Mars. In 1971, Mars 3 had transmitted a garbled signal before falling silent forever. In 1989, American engineers noted strange disruptions during the Phobos-2 transmissions, but NASA never acknowledged them publicly. The shape itself fueled darker theories. To some, it was a natural fragment, a small asteroid passing dangerously close. But asteroids do not cast shadows across planetary surfaces unless they are massive. And if it were that massive, why hadn't it been tracked? Others saw the shape differently, as a ship, a colossal craft, silhouetted in the dying transmissions. Theories sprang up that Mars, or its moon Phobos, was home to something ancient, something artificial. Some even pointed to Phobos' strange orbit, so low, so unstable, that it should have decayed long ago. Soviet scientists like Yosef Shklovsky had once suggested Phobos was hollow, and perhaps even an artificial satellite. Ridiculed at the time, the theory returned with new force after 1989. What if Phobos itself was not natural? What if the probe had glimpsed the truth, that we are not the only engineers in the solar system? Of course, official explanations smothered the mystery. The Soviet Academy of Sciences issued a bland report about instrument failure. Western astronomers repeated the line. The photos, they claimed, were meaningless. But behind the curtain, the images were classified. Engineers were warned not to discuss them. The most haunting thought is this: Phobos-2 may have captured the first clear evidence of something vast, deliberate, and non-human operating in orbit around Mars, and within seconds, it was gone. Whether it was silenced by malfunction or by something more deliberate, the result was the same. The shadow vanished with the spacecraft. The evidence was buried, and only whispers remained. But as history shows, silence does not erase. It lingers, heavy, like a weight pressing on the edges of memory, and the shadow of Phobos-2 continues to stretch across time, asking a question no one dares to answer. What if we were never alone on Mars? When the Soviet Union collapsed just 2 years after the loss of Phobos-2, many of its secrets were buried with it. Archives were sealed, files went missing, and those who had worked on the mission scattered. For decades, the story of Phobos-2 remained a ghost, half remembered, half forbidden. In the West, the incident was written off as just another Soviet failure. But inside Russia, whispers never faded. Retired engineers hinted at photographs not suitable for release. Military officers claimed the probe had been interfered with, and some, like Marina Popovich, openly declared that Phobos-2 had encountered a massive, unknown craft. The strangest part was how quickly the world forgot. Unlike Apollo or Voyager, the Phobos program vanished from public memory. Perhaps it was because the USSR itself disintegrated, or perhaps because some stories are easier to erase than to explain, but echoes remained. Later missions to Mars also met strange fates. The European Space Agency lost its Beagle 2 lander in 2003. NASA's Mars Observer vanished in 1993, just before entering orbit. Each failure blamed on malfunction, each one leaving the same uneasy pattern. Mars swallows probes. Phobos itself remains an enigma. Its orbit is decaying unnaturally fast. Its density suggests hollowness. Its grooves and craters look less like geological scars and more like scars of engineering. Some astronomers quietly admit it behaves like a construct, a satellite, not a moon. And so the legacy of Phobos-2 is not only its shadow, but its silence. If the images truly showed a colossal object near Mars, then the world had its first undeniable evidence of something alien in our solar system. But instead of revelation, the story was buried beneath bureaucracy, collapse, and denial. Maybe the truth is this: Phobos-2 saw something we were never meant to see, and in seeing it, it was silenced. The question is not whether the shadow is real. The question is why it was hidden. Because if it was a malfunction, why were the final images classified? If it was natural, why were the scientists forbidden to speak? And if it was artificial, then who was watching? Perhaps Mars and its moons are not empty at all. Perhaps they are guarded. Perhaps they are reminders that we are not free to wander unobserved. Phobos-2 may have been a warning, a message written not in words, but in absence, a shadow across the red planet, followed by silence. And as humanity prepares for new missions to Mars, the memory of that silence lingers. If the shadow returns, if another probe sees what Phobos-2 saw, will the world be told the truth? Or will the story vanish again into classified vaults, buried beneath denials? One thing is certain. In 1989, the Soviet Union reached out toward Mars and was answered by something it could not explain. Phobos-2 is gone, but the shadow it cast remains. And in the stillness of the Martian night, the silence feels less like an accident and more like a warning.